In just 7 minutes, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett exposed a $5 million secret that left the entire courtroom speechless. It wasn't just about money. It was about a child, a contract, and a former president who thought no one would ever dare speak the truth. What she revealed was bigger than politics. It was a $5 million contract tied to the gender of Joe Biden's unborn child. If it was a boy, millions were paid for Jill Biden. If it was a girl, the deal vanished. No trust fund, no legacy, just silence. But Jasmine didn't stop there. She showed documents, wire transfers, and a letter, signed, notarized, and sealed with power. In a world where women are told to smile, to stay quiet, to carry the shame in silence, she chose to speak. If one man can write a $5 million contract on a baby's gender, how many other deals have been made in secret? And more importantly, who's still paying the price today? And to better understand this story, we have to go back to where it all began. It started like every other oversight committee hearing. Too much polish, too little truth. The room had that unmistakable Capitol stiffness to it, a blend of waxed wood, recycled air, and the unspoken tension that only breaks when someone important decides it's their turn to talk. Cameras were already rolling, sweeping slowly from left to right, like hungry lions scanning for the weakest prey. Staffers whispered, sipped lukewarm coffee, shuffled papers, not because they needed to, but because silence was awkward in a room full of egos. And then there he was. Joe Biden, former president, seated early and comfortably like the man who believed this whole performance had been written for him. His grin was rehearsed, part politician, part showman, as if he already knew the ending and just had to sit through the boring middle. His lawyers were lounging more than listening, their pens idle, eyes half closed. One of them smirked without reason, just the type of confident expression lawyers wear when they believe the system is a game they've already mastered. There was a thick sense of routine in the air, the kind of routine that breeds carelessness. The kind of carelessness that forgets history only shifts when someone dares to move sideways. The kind of carelessness that didn't notice the storm quietly brewing behind a single, unassuming envelope. The doors creaked open, but no one really looked up. Not at first. No entourage, no press swarm, no pre-announcement, just Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, walking in like she wasn't part of the play, like she was here to rewrite it. No staff followed behind her. No intern rushed to hold her papers. No assistant whispered talking points into her ear. She didn't even bring a laptop. What she carried looked small, forgettable even. A plain manila envelope, tucked under one arm like a letter sent from a distant cousin. The kind you don't open right away. But this one could have detonated a dynasty. As she moved past the row of stone-faced aides and board lobbyists, a few heads turned, not because she demanded attention, but because her calm, unrushed gait cut straight through the performative bustle of the room. She was out of rhythm with the Capitol's usual choreography, and that's what made her dangerous. You could almost hear it in the shift of air pressure, like when a storm system slides silently into town and no one notices, until it starts breaking windows. The camera operators, seasoned and cynical, instinctively zoomed in on her without knowing why. Maybe it was the envelope. Maybe it was the silence around her. Or maybe, just maybe, they knew. Something had changed the moment she stepped inside. As Jasmine slid into her seat, adjusting the microphone with the kind of steady grace that comes from knowing you're not here to perform, but to dismantle, Joe Biden leaned forward with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You always look angry, Jasmine," he said, voice dripping with condescension and faux charm. "Maybe next time bring solutions, not complaints." A few Republican aides chuckled, a polite but pointed laugh, the kind designed not for humor, but humiliation. One of Biden's lawyers cracked a sideways grin and leaned back in his chair, eyes darting toward the nearest camera like he was already planning how the clip might play on tomorrow's news cycle. You could see the smirk building. This was their stage, their moment. And Jasmine, in their minds, she was just another brief interruption. She didn't flinch. She didn't respond. She didn't even smile. She just tapped her pen once on the desk, a quiet click that cut through the noise sharper than a gavel. That single sound held more weight than anything said so far. Because in that moment, without raising her voice, without even speaking yet, Jasmine had shifted the power dynamic of the entire room. And though they didn't know it yet, everyone there, Biden, his legal team, the committee members, even the viewers at home, had just been placed on notice. The envelope hadn't even been opened, but already something irreversible had begun. And as the camera zoomed in just a little tighter on her face, America leaned in too, not yet understanding, but beginning to feel that this was not going to be just another hearing. This was going to be the day silence broke its contract. The smirk on Joe Biden's face hadn't faded yet. Leaning back in his chair, arms crossed with that performative comfort only longtime politicians have perfected, he tilted his head and offered one more jab with a grin. "Well, I just hope your envelope has better ratings than your last speech." Laughter scattered from his side of the aisle. The kind of shallow, planned chuckles that weren't meant to be funny, just dismissive. One of his lawyers let out a breathy, "Ha," and shook his head like Jasmine had already lost. You could feel it in the room. The unspoken agreement that this would be over before it began. Narrator. It was the kind of line you'd toss out before a poker game, assuming everyone was still playing cards. But Jasmine wasn't holding cards. She brought a bomb, and he just lit the fuse. The moment was too casual, too smug. And that was his mistake, because in this room, the loudest voice wasn't going to win. The quiet one with the facts would. Jasmine didn't laugh. She didn't even raise an eyebrow. She simply reached down and rested her hand on the envelope, fingers splayed like she was touching something sacred. For a moment, she didn't move. And then, with the slow, deliberate energy of someone fully aware of what she was about to unleash, she slid it forward across the polished wood. The envelope whispered as it moved, a soft friction against the desk that still somehow sounded louder than the laughter had seconds ago. The red wax seal on its flap chipped slightly as her finger lifted, just enough to show time had worn it, but not broken it. The room didn't speak, but the cameras did. One zoomed in instinctively, another panned slowly from the envelope to her face. But Jasmine wasn't looking at Biden anymore. Her eyes were fixed on the main camera, the one feeding live into homes across the country. And with that stare, she broke the fourth wall of politics. She wasn't speaking to the committee now. She was speaking to America. And for the first time, everyone in the room felt it. This wasn't going to be a soundbite. This was going to be a reckoning. Then she spoke. Calm, firm, unhurried. "This hearing is about proposed cuts to health care for low-income mothers," she said, her voice barely rising. "But before we discuss what you're willing to take away, Mr. Biden, I think it's only fair we examine what you were once willing to pay." She clicked the small remote beside her, and instantly the monitor behind her glowed to life. A document appeared. The screen read, "Wire transfer confirmation. March 4th, 2005. The camera zoomed in as a sharp gasp rustled the gallery. The amount was crystal clear. $23 million sent from a private account in Delaware to an offshore foundation in the Cayman Islands, labeled Future Heritage Trust. She paused only for breath, letting the number settle like dust on glass. Then, almost like an afterthought, "That's 7 weeks before your son, Hunter, was born." Chairs creaked. Pens stopped moving. One of Biden's lawyers knocked over a water bottle, but nobody picked it up. Another leaned toward the screen like he couldn't believe what he was seeing, or maybe hoped it would disappear if he stared long enough. Narrator. The baby had a trust before he had a crib. The temperature in the room dropped. Not physically, but emotionally. That moment, that number, rewrote everything that had come before it. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was about proof. And Jasmine? She hadn't even opened the envelope yet. The screen behind Jasmine flickered again, and a second document loaded slowly, as if even the computer sensed the weight of what it was about to display. It was a scanned copy of trust paperwork, its edges slightly curled, its header marked with the emblem of the Future Heritage Trust. Jasmine didn't say anything at first. She simply let the camera zoom in. The words were highlighted in yellow, bold, unmistakable, and horrifyingly specific. Clause C, she began, reading with the clarity of a surgeon making an incision. In the event that the child born is male, the sum of $23 million shall be released to Mrs. Jill Biden, trustee and spouse of Joseph R. Biden. She let that hang for a beat, just enough for it to land, then continued. In the event that the child is female, the trust shall dissolve in its entirety. No disbursement, no residual payout, no discussion. There were no gasps, not the loud, dramatic ones you might expect. The sound that filled the chamber was far worse. It was the absence of it, the kind of silence that doesn't lift but sinks, like lead, like a confession so raw the air itself hesitates to carry it. One Republican aide reflexively scribbled something onto a legal pad, but then, as if realizing there were no spin lines to help, scratched it out with the side of his hand. The Democratic side of the room didn't move either. Because how do you lean into a revelation like that? The clause didn't just sound cruel. It sounded cold-blooded. This wasn't estate planning. This was eugenics by checkbook. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She leaned forward just slightly, enough for the microphone to pick up the sharp edge in her calm. Her next words landed like a blade dipped in velvet. So let me ask, she said, eyes still fixed on the screen, though everyone in the room could feel her gaze cut through them. Was this child a private joy or a public investment? She wasn't asking Biden. She was asking the country. And the country at that moment was holding its breath. One of Biden's lawyers, the youngest one, suddenly started flipping through a thick binder with frantic hands, the way someone might search for a fire escape in a burning building. His eyes scanned for a clause, a footnote, a legal precedent, anything that could explain away the horror that now stared at them in black and white. But there was nothing. There was no explanation, no spin, no path back to normal. Only the truth, and it was staring at them all from the screen behind Jasmine, lit up like a neon confession. The cameras didn't move. The audience watching at home didn't blink. And Joe Biden, for the first time that morning, he wasn't smiling. The screen behind Jasmine flickered again. This time, what appeared wasn't another contract or trust document. It was a photo, grainy and gray, like something pulled from an archive surveillance feed. A woman sat at a medical desk in Zurich. Her face was blurred for safety, but her posture was tense, her hands folded tightly in front of her, as if even in anonymity, the weight of what she remembered hadn't let her go. The committee members leaned in slightly, uncertain whether they were looking at a witness, a whistleblower, or something altogether more dangerous. Then came the audio. A female voice, altered electronically to preserve identity, echoed softly through the speakers. They said it was diplomatic, discreet. They made it clear they didn't want attention. The request was specific, male-only embryo transfer. That one sentence ended all attempts at normalcy in the room. Up until that point, there had still been space, however small, for Biden's allies to chuckle uncomfortably, to roll their eyes, to pretend Jasmine was reaching too far. But now the line between rumor and record had been crossed. This wasn't gossip, it was testimony. There was a shift in the room, not loud, not explosive, just a subtle tightening of breath, the kind of discomfort that doesn't move the body but seizes it. One committee member nervously cleared his throat, the only sound for several seconds. The nurse continued slowly. I'd worked at the Zurich Zentrum for reproductive medicine for 12 years. I'd never seen a request phrased like that. Not preferred gender. Not even selective implantation. It was blunt. Implantation of male embryo only. The clause was typed and signed by a U.S. legal representative. I was told not to ask questions. The audio faded, the screen dimmed. And yet somehow the weight of those words remained, echoing louder in silence than they had through the speakers. With the calm of someone who's not performing but revealing, Jasmine stepped back to the mic and lifted a set of documents. She held them up just long enough for the cameras to focus. Not printed screenshots, not excerpts from blogs or tabloids, but official paperwork, clean, crisp, stamped with the unmistakable emblem of the Zurich Zentrum. There were no flashy graphics, no theatrical outbursts, just black ink, white paper, and a truth that had finally surfaced. "The Swiss don't gamble," the narrator intoned dryly, the sarcasm barely masking the disgust. But someone else clearly did. The audience at home could feel it now. Not just the corruption of money, but the manipulation of life itself. This wasn't just about a family's private choices. This was about how wealth could sculpt biology, how inheritance could be engineered before a heartbeat ever formed, how a child's gender could be bought and paid for with the same cold precision used to purchase stocks or political favors. And Jasmine, she didn't blink, because everything she was revealing, every sheet of paper, every testimony, every stamp, had one goal: to expose not just a contract, but a mindset, one that saw children not as gifts, but as assets. And from the look on Biden's face and the stillness of his legal team, it was clear. The curtain had been pulled back and there was no putting it down again. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached into the envelope again, slower this time, like she was peeling back the final layer of a wound the nation didn't even know it had. From within, she pulled out a single sheet of paper, thin but devastating. It looked like any other legal document, white, perfectly formatted, with sharp font and professional margins. But what was written on it would burn through every layer of pretense in that room. Jasmine didn't look at Biden. She didn't look at the lawyers. She read directly to the room, her voice cool but edged now, each word slicing just a little deeper. "Line 8, Clause C," she said. "Subject, Jill Biden, agrees to attempt production of a male heir. Upon successful confirmation of male offspring, compensation in the amount of $5 million shall be issued by Joseph R. Biden via designated estate vehicle." There was a strange pause, the kind that happens when people are trying to figure out if what they heard was a mistake or if they just stepped into a moral freefall. One congressman coughed. Another shifted in his seat as if trying to distance himself from the air around him. The absurdity of the phrase, "produce male heir," nearly triggered nervous laughter in a few corners of the room, but it died quickly. Because what began as absurdity twisted fast into something much colder. Jasmine's voice tightened, not from nerves, but from principle. "This wasn't family planning," she said slowly, firmly, with a weight that filled every word. "This was legacy engineering. This was commodifying biology. This was an agreement, not between two parents, but between a man and his image of the future. And in that future, girls were worth exactly zero." Then, with one deliberate motion, Jasmine held the contract up. Not like a trophy, not like evidence in a courtroom, but like a mirror. The paper caught the light and glowed under the overheads. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. Because the camera, America's silent witness, was already zooming in, capturing every detail. The signatures at the bottom, the notary stamp embossed in gold, the date inked across the top, January 19th, 2005, and the name typed cleanly in bold, Joseph R. Biden. The silence in the room didn't just settle, it grew, it thickened, it hummed like pressure building inside a sealed chamber. No one dared clear their throat. No aide reached for a phone. Even the gallery filled with hardened reporters used to scandal and spin stayed utterly still. One journalist's fingers hovered above a keyboard, frozen, unsure whether to write or just listen. Because this was no longer a hearing. It wasn't even a confrontation. This was exposure. A moment where ambition met morality in the open daylight, and one of them began to shrivel. Jasmine kept holding the paper high, steady, unwavering. The message wasn't just in the words printed on the contract. It was in the silence that followed. And somewhere in that stillness, the country watching didn't just see the paper. They saw what it stood for. A system where power makes demands, where women sign away silence, and where children, before they ever breathe, become pieces in a deal dressed up as destiny. By now, the room was no longer just silent. It was suspended. It was the kind of stillness that only comes when the performance is over, but the truth still lingers, waiting to be acknowledged. Jasmine reached once more into the envelope, slower than before, as if what came next needed to be handled with reverence. She pulled out a pale sheet of paper, slightly creased, written not in formal legal language, but in the intimate, uneven scrawl of someone who wasn't thinking about cameras or consequences, only what her heart couldn't hold in anymore. It was a letter, a handwritten note, dated months after Hunter's birth. The committee members leaned in instinctively. Something in the tone had shifted. The energy wasn't accusatory anymore. It was personal. Jasmine cleared her throat once, not to steady herself, but to give the moment a breath. Then she read, her voice gentle, almost maternal in its own way. "Sometimes I wonder," she began, "if I gave birth to a boy or a business plan." The line floated in the air like a confession, weightless but devastating. You could feel it land in the chest of everyone present. It wasn't written for defense. It wasn't written for legacy. It was written for truth, by a woman who perhaps no longer recognized her role in the story she helped build. Across the room, a Democratic congresswoman, known for her sharp tongue and zero tolerance for theatrics, blinked hard and quickly looked down. Her hand moved reflexively to her eye. A moment later, a pen dropped somewhere in the gallery, the sound small but piercing. No one moved to pick it up, not because they didn't hear it, but because their bodies couldn't yet process something so ordinary in a moment that had become so extraordinary. Jasmine continued reading small excerpts, her voice steady but softened, carrying the emotional weight of a woman reading another woman's regrets out loud for the first time. "I didn't know how much of myself I'd have to give away for him to keep his version of control. I didn't realize the price wasn't money. It was silence." This wasn't political strategy. This was human unraveling, and the audience, both in the room and across the nation, felt it deep in their bones. Then came the final image. Jasmine turned toward the easel at her side and slowly placed a photograph onto it. The room, as if collectively holding breath again, shifted their eyes to the display. It was a simple picture, a newborn baby wrapped in a white blanket, barely a few days old, his eyes shut, his hands curled softly against his chest. But what made the room falter was what was written just beneath the image. Not a name, not a date, but three hauntingly intentional words. "Legacy secured." Jasmine didn't say anything for a full beat. She let the silence speak. Let the weight of that phrase settle over a room that had finally stopped pretending this was about politics. This was about people. This was about a baby born into paperwork, about a mother who had to wonder if her womb had been reduced to a legal vehicle, and a father who believed the value of a child could be measured by a signature and a clause. The narrator cut in, voice low and heavy. That wasn't a birth certificate. It was a receipt. And in that moment, everyone watching, from Capitol Hill to quiet homes across the country, saw it not just as Jasmine's case, but as a reckoning. A moment when the machinery of power, gender, and money was no longer hidden behind polished press conferences or smiling photo ops. A baby had been used as a brand, a mother as collateral, and truth as currency. But now it was all out in the open. And Jasmine, the woman they once mocked for being too direct, was standing at the very center of it all, with nothing but paper, patience, and unflinching courage. There are moments in political hearings where tension builds slowly, like a faucet dripping into a quiet room. But what happened next was more like the snap of a bone. Jasmine lifted the remote again, the same one she had used earlier. But this time, there was no document, no scanned signature, no birth clause. What came next was a voice, disembodied, confident, and damning. The screen behind her didn't display a face, only the name, Gregory Stanton, a former legal advisor to the Biden family. The room, which had been swallowed by solemnity just moments earlier, braced instinctively. The voice played, calm, unapologetic, casual in a way that made it more horrifying. "She'll get what she needs, as long as I get what I want." That was it. One sentence. 9 words. And yet it cracked through the air with the force of a wrecking ball. There was no need for context, no room for ambiguity. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't taken out of proportion. It was exactly what it sounded like. A trade, a transaction, a calculated, emotionless deal between a man who saw family not as sacred, but as useful. Joe Biden's jaw visibly tightened, not in confusion, but recognition, as if the line wasn't new to him, as if hearing it out loud in this setting was the real betrayal. His lawyers, who had been visibly shifting before, now went completely still. The one closest to him leaned back slowly, hands no longer on the table, gaze fixed straight ahead like a soldier waiting for impact. Nobody said a word. Not because they didn't have questions, but because they didn't know what kind of world those questions now belonged to. Jasmine stepped forward, but not for drama, not to gloat, not even to land a punch. She didn't move like someone seizing victory. She moved like someone revealing a crime scene. There was no rise in her voice, no triumphant tone, no smug smile, only clarity. "You can deny optics," she said plainly. "You can spin headlines, blame timing, cry partisanship, but you can't undo a wire transfer." She turned, pointing softly to the screen behind her. "You can't fake a notary stamp." She paused, her voice now a whisper with more weight than a shout. "And you can't erase this." The line didn't spark outrage. It didn't provoke gasps. It created stillness. A thick, undeniable stillness. The kind that follows a final judgment, or the moment when denial no longer has a place to hide. There was no applause. There were no objections. Because what Jasmine had done wasn't theatrical. It wasn't even political. It was surgical. She had cut through years of legacy, ego, and illusion with a truth so clean it didn't need a second blow. It just needed a camera, a microphone, and someone brave enough to read what was already written. This wasn't the end of a scandal. It was the beginning of a reckoning. For a few moments after Jasmine's final sentence, the room remained frozen, not from confusion, but from recognition. This wasn't one of those dramatic silences people fake for effect. This was the kind of silence that only comes when the mask has slipped, when truth has done what no law or lawsuit could. Joe Biden, who had spent decades mastering every room he entered, every podium he stood behind, now stood differently. Not with the poise of a man preparing a rebuttal, but with the stiffness of someone who knew there was nothing left to say. He rose slowly from his chair, not for control, but because sitting would have felt like surrender. His jaw tightened. His eyes didn't blink. One hand gripped the edge of the desk with just enough force to whiten the knuckles, while the other hovered in the air as if undecided. Should he point? Should he deflect? Or just brace himself for the world that had suddenly shifted around him? But the words didn't come, not because he didn't have any. Biden had built a career on words, but because in that moment, none of them could protect him. None of them could unwind the transfer, or the contract, or the letter. Everything Jasmine said was backed by timestamp, ink, and the unmistakable crack of moral clarity. And now, as the cameras stayed trained on him, he did the only thing he could: stand and absorb the weight of what had already landed. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't grandstand. She didn't even turn to face him directly. Instead, she looked out at the room, at the committee, at the press gallery, at the blinking red light of the main camera, and in a voice softer than any statement she had made so far, she simply said, "I didn't come here to expose a scandal. I came to show you the architecture of silence." That sentence didn't need repetition. It didn't need explanation. It was the kind of line that people write down without being told to, the kind that editors turn into headlines before the meeting even ends. It was already being clipped, captioned, and translated across platforms before the hearing had concluded. Within minutes, it began trending. Within hours, it was printed on protest signs. And within days, it would be quoted in classrooms, columns, and courtrooms alike. Because that sentence wasn't about one man. It was about a system, a legacy of deals made in quiet rooms, truths buried under paperwork, and power protected by the assumption that no one would dare ask the right question. But Jasmine had. And in doing so, she hadn't just shifted a political narrative, she had cracked a cultural one. Not with volume, not with rage, but with precision, patience, and a kind of courage that didn't need applause to be felt. That night, there were no protests, no shouting, no marching. The steps of the Capitol, normally a stage for spectacle, became something else entirely, a space for quiet reckoning. As the sun dipped below the marble dome, people began to arrive, not in waves, but in pairs and families, in solitude. They didn't bring signs, they didn't chant, they carried candles. Some held them high, flickering against the wind. Others placed theirs gently at the base of the stone columns, like offerings. But all of them held something more powerful than fire. They held stillness, a kind of reverence for the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. It wasn't about taking sides anymore. It was about confronting a system that had written rules in ink invisible to the public, until Jasmine Crockett made them legible. A man in his 60s, standing alone near the edge of the crowd, held a candle with both hands. He didn't speak until a young woman beside him asked, "Why are you here?" He answered softly, "My daughter deserved more than silence." A few feet away, a mother held her teenage son close and whispered, "That could have been me." These weren't cries of outrage. They were acknowledgments, confessions of recognition, admissions that what had been revealed was not unfamiliar, only finally exposed. And as the candlelight grew into a quiet constellation across the Capitol steps, a voiceover emerged. Jasmine's words, but carried now by something larger than her. A truth unshackled from the chamber it was born in. If a $5 million contract can decide a child's future, how many more are written every day without cameras watching? And when silence finally breaks, will you recognize the sound? The screen fades to black. No music, no logos, no applause. Just the soft sound of wind moving through a crowd that didn't come to shout, but to listen. Because legacy, it turns out, isn't written by the powerful. It's rewritten by those brave enough to name the silence and refuse to sign their lives beneath it. The characters featured in this story, including Jasmine Crockett, Joe Biden, Jill Biden, and Hunter Biden, are entirely fictional and are not intended to represent real people, real events, or actual public figures. Any resemblance to real individuals is purely coincidental. This story is a work of dramatized fiction created for commentary, reflection, and entertainment purposes under the principles of fair use. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think differently, please consider subscribing to my channel. Your support helps me continue writing powerful, emotional stories that uncover hidden truths, challenge injustice, and give voice to what's often left unsaid. Subscribe now so you never miss the next one.